Welcome to Vendetta Files, where mysterious cases' secrets come back into the light, unsolved crimes and forgotten stories leaves a trace.
It was a bitter, frost-bitten morning in December of 1895. London lay swathed in a heavy yellow fog that clung to the window panes of 220 1B Baker Street like a damp shroud. Inside, however, the hearth blazed with a cheerful ferocity, casting long dancing shadows across the mahogany sideboard and the various chemical apparatuses that littered my friend Sherlock Holmes's laboratory table. Holmes himself was in one of his more introspective humours. He had spent the better part of the morning perched in his armchair, his thin aquiline nose buried in a volume of medieval hagiography, his long nervous fingers occasionally twitching as he turned a page. "I see, Watson," he remarked suddenly without lifting his eyes from the text, "that you have decided to forego the celebratory spirit of the season in favor of a particularly grim post-mortem analysis." I looked up from my medical journal, startled. "How on earth could you know that? I haven't said a word for 20 minutes. It is a simple matter of observation, my dear fellow. You have been holding that journal for some time, yet you have not turned a page since the clock struck 10. Furthermore, your left index finger is stained with the particular violet ink used by the morgue attendants at St. Bartholomew's, a stain that was not there when we shared breakfast. You have been revisiting the curiosities of the East End docks, have you not?" I chuckled, shaking my head. "Your powers of deduction never cease to amaze me, Holmes. I did indeed stop by the hospital this morning to consult on a case of peculiar toxicity. But what of you? Are you finding any festive interest in those dusty accounts of ancient saints?" Holmes tossed the book onto the settee with a sigh of profound boredom. "A mere distraction, Watson. The criminal classes of London seem to have been overcome by a fit of seasonal piety. Not a single problem of intellectual merit has crossed this threshold in 3 days. I am reduced to studying the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian simply to keep my mind from devouring itself." He rose and paced the length of the room, his dressing gown fluttering behind him like the wings of a great, lean bird. He stopped by the window, peering out into the gloom. "Wait," he whispered, his posture suddenly sharpening. "The gods of the macabre may have heard my prayer. Here is a carriage, a private brougham, I believe, and it is stopping at our door. Note the urgency of the coachman, Watson. He does not even wait for the footman to descend. A moment later, the heavy tread of a man in a hurry sounded upon the stairs. Our landlady, Mrs. Hudson, had barely time to announce the visitor before a gentleman burst into the room. He was a man of perhaps 50, dressed in the finest furs, though his face was a mask of such pale, trembling agitation that his outward wealth seemed a mockery. His eyes were wide, darting about the room until they landed on Holmes. "Mr. Holmes," he gasped, clutching the back of a chair for support. "You must come at once. It is an impossibility, a literal, physical impossibility. A man has been murdered in a place where no murderer could possibly have been." Holmes's eyes kindled with that sharp, predatory light that always signaled the start of a chase. He gestured to the settee. "Pray, compose yourself, sir. You are speaking to Sherlock Holmes and my colleague, Dr. Watson. To whom do we have the honour of addressing?" "I am Silas Vane," the man replied, his voice shaking, "the steward of the Oakhaven estate in Surrey. It concerns Sir Julian Burnaby, the master of the house. He was found this morning, dead in the centre of the St. Nicholas Chapel. A tragedy, no doubt," Holmes said coolly, "but death in a chapel is not necessarily a mystery." "You do not understand," Vane cried, leaning forward. "The chapel is a freestanding structure on the estate grounds. Last night was the solo vigil, a tradition held by the Burnaby family for 3 centuries. Sir Julian entered the chapel at midnight and locked the heavy oak doors from the inside. He was to spend the night in prayer and reflection. Outside, a fresh blanket of snow fell throughout the night, pristine and undisturbed. This morning, when he did not emerge, we broke down the door. Sir Julian lay dead before the altar with a blade through his heart. And yet, Mr. Holmes, there were no footprints in the snow surrounding the chapel. The doors were bolted from within. There are no other exits, no secret passages, no windows large enough for a child, let alone a man. He was alone in a sealed stone box, yet he was slaughtered." Holmes rubbed his hands together, a thin smile playing upon his lips. "Watson," he said, turning to me, "I believe we may postpone our Christmas dinner. A locked room, a pristine snowfall, and a victim in the sanctuary. The game, my dear friend, is afoot." The journey to Surrey was a sombre affair. The train rattled through a landscape turned ghostly white by the previous night's storm. Holmes sat in silence, his chin resting on his hands, staring out at the passing hedgerows with a look of intense concentration. Silas Vane sat opposite us, wringing his hands, occasionally offering scraps of information about the deceased. Sir Julian was a man of rigid habits, Vane explained. A widower, quite wealthy but increasingly paranoid in his later years. He believed the solo vigil was the only thing protecting the family line from a supposed medieval curse. He took no weapon with him, only a prayer book and a single candle. "And who else resides at Oakhaven?" Holmes asked, his eyes still fixed on the window. "His nephew and heir, Arthur Burnaby, a young man of, shall we say, spirited temperament, and the ward, Miss Evelyn St. Clair. There is also the vicar, Mr. Hyam, who was the last to see Sir Julian alive before the doors were barred." Spirited temperament, Holmes mused. In the language of stewards, that often translates to gambling debts or profligate living. Am I correct? Vane looked uncomfortable. Arthur has had his difficulties with the London clubs, yes, but to kill his own uncle, in a locked chapel, it is beyond human capability. The word impossible is a term used by those who have failed to observe, Holmes remarked. We arrived at Oakhaven Manor as the short winter afternoon began to fade into a bruised purple twilight. The house was a sprawling Tudor edifice, dark-timbered and imposing against the white fields. But our interest lay several hundred yards away, where a small stone chapel stood like a lonely sentinel on a slight rise of land. As we approached, I saw that the area was cordoned off by several local constables. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, looking particularly windswept and frustrated, stomped across the snow to meet us. "Thank heaven you're here, Holmes," Lestrade grumbled, blowing on his fingers. "I've been here 4 hours and I'm ready to believe in ghosts. It's the most cursed thing I've ever seen." "Ah, Lestrade, I see the cold hasn't dampened your penchant for the supernatural," Holmes joked, though his eyes were already scanning the ground. "Show me the chapel." We walked toward the structure. It was a simple rectangular building of heavy grey stone. As Vane had described, a smooth, unbroken expanse of snow surrounded it on all sides, save for the single path cleared by the servants that morning when they went to check on Sir Julian. Holmes stopped several yards away from the building. He dropped to his knees, heedless of the freezing slush, and began to examine the perimeter with a magnifying glass. "Tell me," Lestrade, Holmes said, his voice muffled as he leaned close to the ground. "At what time did the snow stop falling?" "The groundskeeper says it stopped at 4 this morning. The wind died down shortly after. Any tracks made after that would be as clear as a pikestaff." "And before 4? It was a blizzard, Holmes. Anything made before midnight would have been buried under 6 inches of fresh powder." Holmes rose, brushing the snow from his knees. He looked up at the chapel roof, a steep pitch of slate, and then at the narrow stained glass windows, each no more than 6 inches wide. "No footprints," Holmes murmured. "No disturbed snow on the ledges, no marks on the stone. Let us examine the interior. I am curious to see how the curse chooses to manifest its lethality." Lestrade led us to the heavy oak door. It hung awkwardly on its hinges. The wood around the internal bolts splintered where the servants had used a sledgehammer to gain entry. We stepped inside. The air was frigid, smelling of damp stone and old incense. In the center of the nave, lying face up before a small stone altar, was the body of Sir Julian Burnaby. He was dressed in a simple black robe. A silver-handled dagger was buried deep in his chest, the hilt protruding like a grim ornament. His face was contorted, not in a scream, but in an expression of profound, wide-eyed bewilderment. "Do not touch the body, Watson," Holmes cautioned, though I had already instinctively reached for my medical bag. Holmes began to move about the room with the agility of a cat. He examined the floor, solid flagstones with no gaps. He looked at the altar, the prayer stool, and the single guttered candle that sat in a brass holder. Then he did something peculiar. He knelt by the victim's head and sniffed the air, then leaned down to examine the hem of Sir Julian's robe. "Interesting," Holmes whispered. "What is it?" Lestrade asked eagerly. "Have you found a secret spring? A trapdoor?" Holmes stood up, his face an unreadable mask. "I have found something far more curious, Lestrade. I have found a man who died in a locked room, in the middle of a snowy field, and yet—" His slippers are bone dry. He turned to the inspector, his eyes glinting. "Tell me, Lestrade, who among the household is a particularly fine archer, or perhaps who has a passion for the restoration of medieval clockwork?" Lestrade blinked, utterly confused. I don't see what that has to do with—" "Everything, my dear man. It has everything to do with it," Holmes snapped. He turned to me. "Watson, I believe we should return to the main house. I wish to interview the spirited nephew and the ward. There is a scent in this room, a very faint, very specific scent, and it does not belong in a house of God." As we walked back toward the manor, the wind began to howl again, swirling the snow into ghostly shapes. I looked back at the lonely chapel, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. Holmes was silent, but his fingers were drumming a restless rhythm against his coat, a sure sign that the gears of his great intellect were already turning at a furious pace. Oakhaven's interior was as oppressive as its exterior was grand. Dark oak paneling, polished to a mirror-like sheen, lined the corridors, while portraits of grim-faced Burnabys glared down at us with ancestral disapproval. The air carried the scent of beeswax, stale wood smoke, and a faint, underlying metallic tang that I associated with the very old and the very wealthy. We were shown into the drawing room, where the remaining members of the household had gathered. A young man, handsome in a dissipated fashion, paced the length of the Persian rug. This was undoubtedly Arthur Burnaby. His attire was fashionable but slightly dishevelled, his tie was loosened, and a faint tremor was visible in his hands. Seated near the fire was a young woman of striking poise, her pale face framed by hair as dark as a raven's wing. She was working a piece of embroidery with steady, rhythmic precision, a stark contrast to the young man's agitation. This was Miss Evelyn St. Clair. In the corner, standing like a mournful shadow, was a tall, skeletal man in clerical robes. The vicar, Mr. Hyam. "Mr. Holmes," Arthur Burnaby began, his voice pitched with a nervous edge. "Lestrade says you are a seeker of truth, but I tell you, there is no truth to be found here but the impossible. My uncle died by no mortal hand. The chapel was sealed. The snow was unmarred." Holmes did not answer immediately. He had wandered over to a side table where a collection of curios was displayed. He picked up a small, silver-mounted magnifying glass, turned it over, and replaced it with a dissatisfied click. "A fascinating problem, Mr. Burnaby," Holmes said, finally turning to face him. "But before we invoke the supernatural, let us exhaust the mundane. I see, for instance, that you have recently returned from a journey, likely London, and that your visit was not entirely successful." Arthur gasped, his face flushing a deep crimson. "How could you possibly? Your boots, though cleaned, still bear the yellowish clay unique to the construction excavations near the Strand," Holmes remarked airily. "Furthermore, the way you nervously pat your breast pocket suggests the presence of a heavy envelope, one thick enough to contain a final demand from a creditor, yet light enough to remind you of your empty purse. You went to the city to secure a loan, failed, and returned to find your uncle's death has made such a loan unnecessary. Am I correct?" The young man sputtered, but Miss St. Clair spoke up, her voice cool and melodic. "Mr. Holmes, Arthur's financial indiscretions are no secret, but they do not make him a murderer. Especially not a murderer who can fly across snow without leaving a trace." "Quite so," Holmes conceded with a slight bow toward her. "And you, Miss St. Clair? I observe that you have not slept. The redness in your eyes is not from weeping, for your embroidery is too precise for a grieving ward, but from the strain of reading by candlelight. A specific type of reading, I suspect." The girl's hand faltered for the briefest second. "I find comfort in the classics, Mr. Holmes. The classics, or perhaps the family archives." Holmes countered, his eyes narrowing. "But let us turn to the vicar. Mr. Hyam, you were the last to see Sir Julian alive. You saw him enter the chapel?" The vicar stepped forward, his hands clasped within his voluminous sleeves. "I did, Mr. Holmes. It was precisely midnight. I stood at the threshold and watched as Sir Julian slid the great iron bolt into place. I heard the click of the mechanism. I remained outside for a few moments in prayer. The snow was already falling heavily. When I walked back to the manor, my own tracks were being filled in behind me. "And the keys?" "There are no keys, sir," Hyam replied. "The St. Nicholas Chapel is designed for the vigil. It can only be bolted from the inside. To open it from the outside, one must either wait for the occupant to slide the bolt back or use force, as we were compelled to do this morning." Holmes began to pace, his head bowed, his hands behind his back. A box that only the occupant can close. A field of snow that records every movement. A victim who died in slippers that never touched a snowflake. "It is a delightful puzzle, Watson, truly delightful. But the weapon, Holmes," I interjected. "The dagger in his chest. It was a silver-handled blade. Vane said Sir Julian took no weapon with him." "Indeed," Holmes said, stopping before the fireplace. "Which means the weapon was either already in the chapel, or it was introduced after the door was bolted." "But that's impossible," Lestrade cried from the doorway. "We've searched every inch of that stone pile. No hidden panels, no chutes. The windows are too narrow for a pigeon." Holmes turned his gaze to the fire, the orange glow reflecting in his sharp, intelligent eyes. "When you eliminate the impossible, Lestrade, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. At present, we are still drowning in the impossible. However," he added, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, "I am still haunted by that scent I encountered in the chapel. It was faint, buried beneath the smell of incense and death. It was the scent of bitter almonds." I felt a cold prickle at the base of my neck. "Cyanide, Holmes? Perhaps, Watson. But Sir Julian was stabbed, not poisoned. Why use a blade when the air itself is lethal? And more importantly," he looked directly at Arthur Burnaby, then at the vicar, "why was the victim's prayer book found on the floor, 3 feet away from the altar, with the page for extreme unction, the rite for the dying, carefully dog-eared?" The room fell into a heavy, uncomfortable silence. Holmes checked his pocket watch and gave a curt nod. "I believe a more thorough examination of the manor's library is in order. Watson, if you would be so kind as to accompany me, I have a sudden urge to research the history of the Burnaby family's curse and the mechanical hobbies of the late Sir Julian." As we left the room, I glanced back. Arthur Burnaby had collapsed into a chair, buried his face in his hands, while Miss St. Clair continued her embroidery, her needle flashing in the firelight like a tiny silver dagger. The library of Oakhaven was a cavernous room. Its walls disappeared behind thousands of leather-bound volumes that seemed to swallow the meager light of our lamps. A rolling ladder stood against one shelf, and a massive mahogany desk, cluttered with astronomical charts and mechanical drawings, dominated the center of the room. It was here that Sir Julian had spent his final hours before descending to the chapel for his ill-fated vigil. Holmes, having discarded his overcoat, moved through the room with a feverish energy. He did not look at the books. Instead, he examined the desk, his magnifying glass hovering inches above the surface. "You see, Watson," he murmured, "the late baronet was a man of divided soul. Half of him dwelt in the superstitious terrors of the 14th century, evidenced by his obsession with the family curse, while the other half was firmly rooted in the mechanical marvels of our own age. Look at these schematics." I leaned over. His shoulder. The papers were covered in intricate drawings of escapements, gears, and pendulums. "He was a horologist?" "An amateur of some skill," Holmes replied. "He collected clocks, but more specifically, he designed them. He was fascinated by the automation of movement, the idea that a machine could perform a task in the absence of a human hand." At that moment, the door creaked open, and Inspector Lestrade entered, looking quite pleased with himself. He held a small evidence bag containing a set of keys. "Well, Holmes, I think we can wrap this up before the last train to London," the inspector said, his chest swelling with pride. "We found these in Arthur Burnaby's dressing room, hidden in the toe of a riding boot. They are the keys to the manor's side entrance and a master key to the gun room." "And the dagger, Lestrade?" Holmes asked, not looking up from a drawer he was rummaging through. "Identified. It belongs to a decorative set of Moroccan blades that hung in the hallway. One is missing from its bracket. Arthur's fingerprints aren't on it. He's a clever lad and wore gloves, no doubt, but the motive is as clear as day. He's drowning in debt, he's the sole heir, and he was seen arguing with his uncle just yesterday afternoon. A compelling case, Holmes remarked dryly. And how did he manage the snow? Did he grow wings, or perhaps he walked upon the air? Lestrade's face fell slightly. A trick, Holmes. Some sort of stilts or a leap from a nearby tree. We'll find the tracks once the sun is up. The main point is the motive and the weapon. The main point, Lestrade, is the truth, Holmes said sharply. He had pulled a small leather-bound ledger from the back of the desk drawer. He flipped through the pages, his eyes darting across the entries. Suddenly he froze. A thin, sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the room. "What is it?" I asked, stepping forward. "Have you found a confession?" "Something far more interesting, Watson. A bill of sale." He pointed to an entry dated 3 weeks prior. Sir Julian purchased a significant quantity of highly refined oil and a specialized pneumatic pump from a firm in Birmingham. He also ordered 20 feet of copper tubing. Lestrade scoffed. "Repairing the plumbing, no doubt. Old houses are always falling apart. Really, Holmes, you're chasing shadows while I have the man with the motive in the next room." Holmes ignored him. He walked over to a large grandfather clock in the corner, its pendulum swinging with a rhythmic tock-tock-tock. He opened the glass casing and sniffed the interior. Then, he turned his attention to the floor directly beneath the clock. "Watson, look at this rug," Holmes said, pointing to a heavy Persian carpet. "Tell me what you see." I knelt and examined the intricate patterns. "It seems perfectly ordinary, Holmes. Perhaps a bit worn near the clock." "Precisely. It is worn uniformly. But look at the fringe. On this side, the silk threads are bent toward the wall. On the other, they are bent toward the room. Someone has moved this heavy clock, and recently." "A maid cleaning?" I suggested. "In a room Sir Julian forbade anyone to enter?" "I think not." Holmes stood up, his face clouded with thought. He walked back to the desk and picked up a small discarded scrap of paper from the wastebasket. He smoothed it out, stared at it for a long moment, and then slipped it into his waistcoat pocket. A subtle change had come over him. The restless energy had been replaced by a cold, calculating stillness. "Lestrade," Holmes said, his voice ringing with authority, "you are welcome to hold Mr. Arthur Burnaby on suspicion. Indeed, I would encourage it. It will keep him, shall we say, contained. But I advise you not to file a formal charge just yet." "And why not?" "Because," Holmes said, looking toward the dark window that faced the chapel, "you have forgotten the most vital inconsistency of all. You say the dagger was from the Hall collection. I examined that. Collection on our way in. The missing blade was indeed silver-handled, but it was a blunt ceremonial piece, never sharpened. The weapon in Sir Julian's heart, however, was a professional surgeon's tool, disguised with a silver hilt that did not quite fit the tang." I gasped. "A surgeon's tool? But Holmes, it implies, Watson, that our murderer is someone who understands both the fragility of the human body and the mechanics of a perfect illusion. I have seen enough here. I must return to the chapel alone." "In this dark?" Lestrade asked. "What for?" "To speak with the only witness who cannot lie," Holmes replied enigmatically. "The snow." As Holmes vanished into the foggy night, I looked at Lestrade. The inspector shook his head, muttering about eccentricities, but I felt a heavy knot of dread in my stomach. Holmes had seen something, a hidden thread in the tapestry of this crime, and I knew that before the night was out, the impossible would be stripped away to reveal a very grim reality. The hour grew late, and the atmosphere within Oakhaven Manor curdled into one of profound suspicion. With Holmes vanished into the snowy night and Arthur Burnaby sequestered in a small parlour under the watchful eye of a constable, I found myself alone in the drawing-room with Miss Evelyn St. Clair. The vicar had retired to the chapel's vestry to pray for the departed soul, leaving a silence so heavy it felt as though the very walls were leaning in to listen. Miss St. Clair had finally set aside her embroidery. She stood by the window, her silhouette framed by the frosted glass. "You are very loyal to him, Dr. Watson," she said softly, without turning. "To Mr. Holmes. He is the most remarkable man I have ever known," I replied. "His mind operates on a plane that we mere mortals can scarcely comprehend." "And what does that mind see here?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Does he see a nephew who killed for gold, or does he see the hand of a curse?" that has waited 3 centuries to strike. Holmes does not believe in curses, Miss St. Clair. He believes in cause and effect. Before she could respond, a muffled cry echoed from the depths of the house. It was followed by the frantic ringing of a bell and the sound of heavy boots sprinting across the parquet floors. I rushed into the hallway, nearly colliding with Lestrade, who looked white as a sheet. "The steward," he gasped. "Silas Vane, in the cellar." We hurried down the stone stairs into the cold, damp bowels of the manor. There, sprawled across the floor of the wine cellar, lay Vane. He was not dead, but he was gasping for air, his face twisted in a mask of agony. Scattered around him were several heavy, lead-lined canisters that appeared to have been dragged from a hidden alcove behind a rack of ancient ports. The air, Vane wheezed, clutching his throat. It came from the canisters. I knelt beside him, my medical instincts taking over. I detected that same cloying, sickly sweet scent I had noticed in the chapel. The scent of bitter almonds, now far more concentrated. "Back, Lestrade! Don't breathe it in!" I shouted, dragging Vane toward the stairs. We managed to get the steward into the fresh air of the hallway, where he fell into a fit of violent coughing. He looked terrified, his eyes darting toward the cellar door as if expecting a demon to emerge. "I was only checking the inventory," he managed to say between gasps. I moved the canisters, and a seal must have broken. At that moment, the front door swung open with a crash. Sherlock Holmes stood framed against the swirling snow, his coat dusted with white, his eyes burning with a manic, almost erratic light. He looked from the gasping steward to the cellar door, and then at me. "A second manifestation, Watson," he cried, his voice ringing with a strange, dissonant triumph. The invisible assassin strikes again, though with less lethality this time. How fortunate that our friend Vane has a sturdier constitution than his late master. "Holmes, this man has been poisoned," I exclaimed. "There are canisters of cyanide gas in the cellar." "Cyanide? Oh, I think it is something far more ingenious than mere gas, Watson," Holmes said, beginning to pace the hallway with long, jerky strides. He seemed entirely indifferent to Vane's distress. He stopped abruptly, pulled a handful of slushy snow from his pocket, and dropped it into a silver bowl on a side table. He watched it melt with a disturbing intensity. "The temperature, Watson, that is the key. The chapel was freezing, yet the body was warm. The cellar is cold, yet the canisters are sweating. Everything is in reverse." "Holmes, you're not making sense," Lestrade muttered, looking genuinely worried for my friend's sanity. "We have a man murdered in a locked room, a steward nearly poisoned in the cellar, and you're talking about melting snow." Holmes turned on him, his finger stabbing the air. "I am talking about the physics of a nightmare, Lestrade. Tell me, where is the vicar? Where is Mr. Hyam?" "He's in the vestry of the chapel, as I told you," Lestrade replied. "Then we must go there at once," Holmes snapped, his erratic energy suddenly snapping into a cold, hard focus. "For if my calculations are correct, the curse of the Burnabys is about to claim its final victim, and the murderer is currently standing in a place where no one can see them, even though they are in plain sight." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and vanished back into the night, heading toward the chapel. "Is he mad?" Vane whispered, still clutching his chest. "No," I said, grabbing my medical bag and following Holmes. "He is simply seeing the world as it truly is, and I fear that what he sees is a tragedy that is not yet finished." As we ran toward the chapel, the wind died down, leaving an eerie, suffocating silence. The stone structure loomed ahead, dark and silent, but as we drew closer, I saw a faint flickering light through the narrow, stained glass windows. Someone was inside. And as Holmes reached the door, he didn't knock. He put his ear to the wood, a grim smile vanishing from his face to be replaced by a look of sudden, sharp alarm. "The bolt, Watson," he shouted. "We must break it down again. Now." The second breach of the St. Nicholas Chapel was more violent than the first. Under the weight of the constable's shoulder and Lestrade's frantic kicks, the heavy oak door gave way with a sickening groan of tortured iron. We tumbled into the sanctuary, our lanterns swinging wildly, casting chaotic arcs of light across the cold, vaulted ceiling. The vicar, Mr. Hyam, was not dead. He was kneeling at the altar, exactly where the body of Sir Julian had lain hours before. He did not rise as we entered. He merely turned a ghostly, tear-streaked face toward us, his hands trembling as they clutched a heavy rosary. "It is here," Hyam whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "The shadow has returned. Can you not smell it? The scent of the tomb?" Lestrade ignored the man's dramatics, his eyes darting around the small stone chamber. "Where is he, Holmes? You said the curse was striking again. I see nothing but a frightened priest in a cold room." Holmes did not answer. He was already on the move, his movements methodical and silent. He ignored the vicar entirely, stepping instead toward the stone altar. He pulled a small, silver-backed mirror from his pocket and held it against the surface of the flagstones, where the victim's head had rested. Then he held it up to a small ornamental drainage hole in the stone floor, a feature common in medieval chapels for the washing of the altar. I watched, fascinated, as Holmes's expression shifted from intense concentration to a cold, grim satisfaction. He reached into the drainage hole with a pair of long, thin tweezers and extracted a tiny, translucent fragment. It was no larger than a fingernail, shimmering slightly in the lantern light before he quickly dropped it into a glass vial. "What is that?" I asked, leaning in. "A piece of glass?" "A fragment of a shattered illusion, Watson," Holmes replied enigmatically. He turned his attention to the heavy velvet cloth that draped the altar. He lifted the corner, examining the underside. "Lestrade," Holmes called out, his voice sharp. "Come here, tell me what you make of this." The inspector hurried over. On the underside of the altar cloth, hidden from casual view, was a faint circular stain, no larger than a shilling, of a deep brownish-red hue. "Blood?" Lestrade suggested. "The victim's blood must have soaked through." "Impossible," I countered. Sir Julian was found lying on his back, and the dagger remained in the wound, sealing it effectively. Gravity would not have pulled the blood upward into the underside of the altar cloth. "Exactly, Watson," Holmes cried, his eyes flashing. "A brilliant observation of the mundane. And yet, the stain is there, and it carries that same curious odor, the bitter almonds of the cellar." Lestrade scoffed, his patience clearly at an end. "Holmes, we have Arthur Burnaby with a motive and a missing dagger. We have Silas Vane nearly killed by the very gas we found in the cellar. The case is practically solved. Vane was clearly trying to hide the evidence of the poison he used, and he botched it, or perhaps Arthur planted it there to frame the steward. Either way, the culprit is in the house." Holmes straightened up, tucking the glass vial into his waistcoat. For a moment, he looked as though he were about to speak, to reveal the logic that was so clearly clicking into place behind his high, pale forehead. Then he glanced at the vicar, who was still muttering prayers in the corner, and a look of guarded secrecy came over him. "You are quite right, Lestrade," Holmes said, his voice suddenly smooth and devoid of its earlier excitement. "The evidence against the household is substantial. It would be a foolish man who looked elsewhere." "Then you agree?" Lestrade asked, surprised by Holmes's uncharacteristic concession. "I agree that the impossible has become very crowded," Holmes replied. "Watson, if you would be so kind as to assist Mr. Hyam back to the manor. The cold is ill-suited for a man of his years. I shall remain here for a few moments longer to commune with the stones." As I led the shivering vicar out of the chapel, I looked back at my friend. Holmes was standing perfectly still in the center of the room, staring up at the narrow stained-glass window of St. Nicholas. He looked like a statue himself, carved from the same cold grey stone as the chapel. I knew that look. Holmes had found the secret clue, the one inconsistency that didn't fit Lestrade's tidy theory of greedy nephews and bumbling stewards. But as we walked through the snow, I found myself plagued by the same question that had haunted me since we arrived. How could a man be stabbed in a locked, snowbound room? And why, if he were stabbed, was the air filled with the scent of a deadly poison that had left him untouched? Lestrade marched ahead, confident in his impending arrest. But I could not shake the feeling that we were all walking into a trap, and that the real murderer was watching us from the shadows of the manor, laughing at the inspector's simplicity. When Holmes returned to the manor an hour later, his appearance was enough to startle the most stoic observer. His collar was upturned, his eyes possessed a feverish, almost wild brilliance, and his hands were stained a deep, oily black. He did not speak to Lestrade, who was currently overseeing the formal questioning of Arthur Burnaby, nor did he acknowledge the presence of Miss St. Clair, who watched him from the shadows of the gallery with a look of growing apprehension. "Watson!" Holmes barked, his voice echoing in the marble hall. "I require your assistance, and I require it with the utmost silence and speed." I followed him into the small laboratory he had commandeered in the manor's sunroom. On the table lay a bizarre assortment of objects, a length of copper tubing he had likely scavenged from the library's repairs, a bellows from the fireplace, a heavy block of ice from the kitchen's larder, and the silver-handled dagger that had been extracted from Sir Julian's breast. "Holmes, what in heaven's name?" "Shh," he hissed, his long fingers working with a precision that belied his frantic energy. He was attaching the copper tubing to the nozzle of the bellows, sealing the joint with a thick, foul-smelling resin. "The mind, Watson, is like a steam engine. It must have a vent, or it will explode. Mine is currently at 1,000 pounds of pressure." For the next hour, I watched in bewildered silence as my friend engaged in what appeared to be the play of a madman. He used a small jeweler's saw to shave the block of ice into a specific, tapered shape. He then took the silver hilt of the ceremonial dagger, which he had somehow retrieved from Lestrade's evidence bag, and began to fuse it to the ice using a mixture of salt and freezing water. "You are making a weapon," I whispered, the realization chilling me more than the winter air. "I am making a ghost, Watson," Holmes replied, his eyes fixed on his work. "A ghost that can penetrate a locked door and vanish into the air, leaving only the scent of a bitter memory behind." Suddenly, he straightened up, his erratic movements snapping into a terrifyingly cold stillness. He checked his pocket watch. "Midnight approaches," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "The anniversary of the vigil is not yet over. We must stage a performance, Watson, a play for a single spectator who believes they are the only one who knows the script." He stepped to the door and flung it open, calling out to the house at large. "Inspector Lestrade, Mr. Vane, Miss St. Clair, I invite you all to the St. Nicholas Chapel. The impossible is about to be performed once more, and I promise you the finale will be most illuminating." Lestrade appeared, looking exasperated. "Holmes, this is preposterous. The suspects are under guard. The snow is falling again. We can't go trekking back out there for a magic show." "It is not a magic show, Inspector," Holmes said, his voice ringing with a sudden dangerous authority. "It is a demonstration of how a man can be murdered in a sealed box without the killer ever stepping foot on the snow. If you wish to make an arrest that will stand in a court of law, you will follow me. If not, then you may explain to Scotland Yard why you allowed a murderer to walk free under the guise of a curse." The gravity in Holmes's tone was undeniable. Reluctantly, the group assembled. Arthur Burnaby was brought out, looking pale and broken. Silas Vane followed, still leaning on a cane, and the vicar joined us, his face a mask of ecclesiastical dread. As we marched through the dark, the wind whipped the fresh snow into blinding eddies. Holmes led the way, carrying a heavy, shrouded object under his arm. He seemed possessed by a demonic energy, his strides long and purposeful. When we reached the chapel, the scene was as we had left it, cold, silent, and terrifyingly isolated. Holmes ordered everyone to stand back, at least 20 paces from the stone walls. "Watch the snow," Holmes commanded, his voice rising above the wind. "Watch it closely, for in a moment I shall demonstrate how Sir Julian met his end. And as I do, I want you to ask yourselves, who among you stood to lose everything if the vigil was completed? Who knew the secrets of the altar better than the man who built it?" He stepped toward the chapel door, but he did not enter. Instead, he moved toward the rear of the building, toward the small ornamental drainage hole he had examined earlier. He knelt in the snow, his back to us, his hands moving with rhythmic intensity. "Watson, the bellows!" he shouted. I hurried forward and began to pump the handle as he had instructed. A high-pitched whistling sound began to emanate from the copper tubing. Holmes leaned into the stone wall, his face pressed against the masonry. "Now!" he cried. A muffled thud sounded from within the chapel. It was followed by a sharp, crystalline shatter. "Inside!" Holmes yelled, leaping to his feet and sprinting toward the door. "Into the chapel before the evidence evaporates." We rushed through the broken door. The sanctuary was empty, save for the flickering shadows of our lanterns. But there, in the center of the floor, exactly where Sir Julian had fallen, lay the silver hilt of the Moroccan dagger. But there was no blade, only a small, rapidly spreading puddle of water, and a faint cloying scent that filled the room like a physical presence. "Cyanide," I gasped, recognizing the odor instantly. "No, Watson," Holmes said, pointing to the altar cloth, where a fresh brownish-red stain was blooming. "Not cyanide, nitrobenzene, a chemical that smells of almonds, acts as a powerful solvent, and when frozen into a shard of ice, along with a concentrated anticoagulant, creates a blade that kills and then disappears into the victim's own bloodstream." He turned slowly to face the group, his eyes landing on a single trembling figure. The snow did not record the killer's tracks, because the killer never left the manor. The murder was committed by a man who used a pneumatic delivery system, the very one described in the library's ledgers, to fire a frozen projectile through the drainage hole he himself had modified. Holmes took a step forward, his shadow looming large against the altar. "Shall I tell them how you did it, or will you confess that the curse was merely a mechanical convenience, Mr. Vane?" The silence that followed Holmes's accusation was more chilling than the Surrey wind. Silas Vane, the man who had appeared so broken and victimized only hours before, seemed to shrink within his fur-lined coat, his eyes once wide with feigned terror, narrowed into two hard, glittering points of malice. A frozen projectile. Lestrade broke the silence, his voice echoing with skepticism. "Holmes, you are suggesting a fairy tale. I see a hilt, yes, but to fire a shard of ice through a drainage pipe and hit a man squarely in the heart. The odds are astronomical." "To the average mind, perhaps," Holmes said, his voice regaining its calm professorial tone. "But Sir Julian was a man of ritual. Every year, at the stroke of midnight, he knelt at that exact spot on the flagstones to begin his vigil. His position was fixed, his timing predictable. He was a stationary target in a controlled environment." Holmes paced the small area around the altar, his lantern illuminating the floor. "Consider the clues, Lestrade. The victim's slippers were dry. This told me immediately that he had not been pursued into the chapel, nor had he left it. He entered, he bolted the door, and he knelt. The snow remained pristine because the killer never approached the building. But the scent of bitter almonds, that was the signature of the assassin. "Nitrobenzene," I murmured, recalling Holmes's earlier exclamation. "Exactly, Watson. Nitrobenzene, often used in the manufacture of soaps and perfumes, has a high freezing point and a distinct almond odor. When mixed with a concentrated anticoagulant and frozen into a needle-sharp bolt, it becomes a deadly weapon. It penetrates the flesh, enters the bloodstream, and as it melts at body temperature, it leaves only a puncture wound that appears to be a stab from a narrow blade." The silver hilt was merely a theatrical touch, held in place by a clever mechanical catch at the end of the delivery tube, designed to drop onto the floor as the ice bolt struck home, giving the appearance of a physical struggle. Holmes turned his gaze back to Vane. The library ledgers told the story. Sir Julian had purchased a pneumatic pump and copper tubing. He thought he was working on a new horological experiment, perhaps a way to power his clocks with air pressure. But you, Vane, were the one who facilitated the purchases. You redirected those materials. You installed the tubing beneath the floorboards of the manor, running it through the old servants' conduits and out through the drainage hole of this chapel. "You have no proof," Vane hissed, though his voice lacked conviction. On the contrary, Holmes countered. "The poisoning in the cellar was your greatest mistake. You feared I was getting too close to the pneumatic system hidden behind those wine racks. You staged a leak to keep us away from the cellar, but you used the same nitrobenzene that was intended for the murder. You didn't realize that a doctor like Watson would recognize the difference between the choking lethality of cyanide and the specific, cloying irritation of nitrobenzene vapors." I looked at the steward with a mixture of horror and disgust. "You killed a man who trusted you for years, Vane. Why? Trust?" Vane laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "Sir Julian was a madman. He was going to liquidate the estate to build a temple to his own paranoia. He was going to leave us all in the gutter, his nephew, the ward, and the man who had kept his accounts in order for 2 decades while he played with gears and ghosts. I didn't kill him for greed, I killed him for survival." "And the daggers?" Lestrade asked. "The one in the hall?" A clumsy misdirection, Holmes answered for him. Vane took the ceremonial hilt to ensure that if the ice blade was discovered for what it was, suspicion would fall on the nephew, who had a known motive and access to the collection. He even dog-eared the prayer book to extreme unction, to suggest a ritualistic or suicidal element, further muddying the waters. Holmes reached into his pocket and produced the small scrap of paper he had found in the library wastebasket. And finally this, a calculation of air pressure and velocity, written in a hand that was not Sir Julian's. It was yours, Mr. Vane. You were testing the trajectory. You are a man of many talents, but you forgot that a master of machines is always at the mercy of the traces those machines leave behind. Lestrade stepped forward, his silver handcuffs glinting in the lantern light. Silas Vane, I am arresting you for the murder of Sir Julian Burnaby. Vane did not resist. He went limp, the fire of his defiance extinguished as quickly as it had been lit. As the constables led him away through the snow, the vicar crossed himself, muttering a prayer for a soul that seemed well beyond the reach of his orisons. A remarkable solution, Holmes, I said, feeling the weight of the night finally begin to lift. But the curse, the legend of the St. Nicholas shadow. Holmes looked up at the moon, which had finally broken through the clouds, bathing the snowy fields in a cold silver light. The only shadows we need fear, Watson, are those that dwell within the human heart. The impossible is often merely the intricate, viewed through the lens of fear. Now come. I believe I promised you a Christmas dinner, and if we hurry, we might yet find a carriage that hasn't been turned into a pumpkin by the lateness of the hour. The return to Oakhaven Manor was a far more subdued affair than our frantic trek to the chapel had been. The biting wind had died down to a whisper, and the moon, now clear of the heavy snow clouds, turned the Surrey landscape into a shimmering world of silver and shadow. Inside the manor, the heavy air of suspicion had lifted, replaced by a weary, hollow relief that often follows the exposure of a great evil. Arthur Burnaby sat by the dying fire in the drawing-room, a glass of brandy trembling in his hand. He looked older than he had that afternoon. The weight of being a prime suspect in a capital crime had left deep lines of exhaustion on his handsome face. Beside him, Miss Evelyn St. Clair remained as composed as ever, though her dark eyes betrayed a deep sense of contemplation. I owe you my life, Mr. Holmes, Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. Lestrade was convinced of my guilt. If you had not seen past the appearance of things, I should have spent the rest of my days in a cell, or worse. Holmes, who had shed his damp coat and was currently warming his long, thin hands by the hearth, turned his head slightly. You owe your life to the laws of physics, Mr. Burnaby, and to the fact that you are far too impulsive a young man to have planned such a meticulously cold-blooded crime. Murder of this caliber requires a patience and a mechanical aptitude that, by your own admission, you lack. However, Holmes added, his eyes narrowing, I suggest you take this escape as a mandate for a change in lifestyle. A man with such a fortune should not be so easily framed by his own debts. Arthur nodded solemnly, the rebuke landing with more weight than any sermon the vicar could have delivered. But Mr. Holmes, Evelyn St. Clair intervened, her voice steady and curious. The steward, Vane, I knew he was meticulous, but to think he could conceive of something so ghoulish, how did he manage to conceal the machinery for so long? Getty Images, it was hidden in plain sight, Miss St. Clair, Holmes explained. The pneumatic system was disguised as part of the estate's aging plumbing and the late Sir Julian's own horological experiments. Vane simply diverted the pressure. The most difficult part was the blade itself. He had to experiment with the freezing point of the nitrobenzene and the anticoagulant to ensure the projectile wouldn't shatter upon exit from the tube, but would remain sharp enough to penetrate the chest cavity. He likely used the cellar's natural chill and perhaps a bit of dry ice from the London suppliers to perfect the bolt. And the smell? I asked, leaning forward. That was the nitrobenzene? Precisely, Watson. To the layman and even to the professional who is expecting it, the scent of nitrobenzene is indistinguishable from the bitter almond odor of cyanide. By making us believe the air in the chapel was poisoned, Vane ensured that no one would look too closely at the stab wound until the evidence, the frozen ice, had already melted and been absorbed into the victim's tissues. It was a masterpiece of misdirection, turning a biological murder into a mechanical one. Lestrade entered the room then, looking somewhat chastened. He had just seen Vane off in the custody of the local constabulary. Well, Holmes, he said, rubbing the back of his neck, I'll admit I thought you'd gone round the bend with the ice blade talk, but the boys found. The copper junction behind the wine rack, just where you said it would be. There was even a scrap of that Moroccan silverwork caught in the pressure seal. He'd been practicing the drop of the hilt. Details, Lestrade, Holmes remarked, a faint smile playing on his lips. The world is full of obvious things which nobody by any chance ever observes. I suppose that's true, the inspector sighed. Still, a man killed by a piece of frozen air. It's going to make for a very strange report at the yard. As the night wore on, the household began to drift toward rest. The vicar took his leave, his faith in the supernatural perhaps slightly shaken by the cold reality of Vane's engineering. Arthur and Evelyn retired to their respective wings, leaving Holmes and me alone in the flickering light of the drawing room. I looked at my friend, who had sunk into a deep armchair, his eyes closed, his chin resting on his chest. In the silence of the old house, the case of the Christmas chapel seemed to take on a new dimension. It was not just a puzzle solved. It was a testament to the fact that even in an age of science and steam, the oldest human motives, greed, fear, and the desire for control, remained the primary engines of tragedy. "You look pensive, Watson," Holmes said without opening his eyes. "I was just thinking," I replied, "how the impossible always seems so simple once you've explained it. And yet without you, the impossible would have stood as a ghost story for generations. All miracles, my dear Watson, are merely the result of a higher logic," Holmes murmured. "Now, if you will excuse me, I believe I shall spend the remainder of the night in silence. The transition from the impossible to the obvious is always a rather exhausting journey for the mind." I left him there, a thin, solitary figure against the dying embers, his great intellect finally finding a moment of repose. As I climbed the stairs to my room, I looked out a hallway window at the St. Nicholas Chapel. It stood silent and dark in the snow, no longer a place of terror, but merely a small stone building, its secrets laid bare by the light of reason. The journey back to London was as quiet as the departure had been frantic. The rhythmic clacking of the train wheels against the iron rails provided a steady, hypnotic accompaniment to my reflections. Holmes sat buried in a thick travelling rug, his eyes closed, though the slight twitch of his eyebrows told me that his mind was far from dormant. It was only as the suburbs of South London began to replace the snow-dusted fields of Surrey that he finally spoke. "You are extraordinarily silent, Watson," he remarked, opening one eye to peer at me. "I trust the impossible has not left you with a permanent distaste for the festive season." "On the contrary, Holmes," I replied, folding my newspaper. "I was merely reflecting on the coldness of it all, not the weather but the calculation. To use a man's own hobbies, his own religious traditions, and even the very air of his sanctuary to strike him down." Vane's mind was a dark place indeed. It was a mind of a specific type, Watson. The technical mind without the anchor of morality is a dangerous thing. Vane saw the world as a series of levers and pulleys. To him, Sir Julian was not a benefactor or even a human being. He was merely a cog that had become misaligned with the machinery of Vane's own security. When a cog causes friction, the engineer removes it. "But the ingenuity of it," I exclaimed. "The nitrobenzene ice bolt. It seems almost a waste of genius to apply it to murder." Holmes sighed, looking out at the soot-stained brickwork of the London tenements. "Genius, Watson, is often a matter of perspective. Vane applied a high degree of technical skill to a low purpose. It is a common enough tragedy. I have seen more intellect in the design of a bank vault heist than in many a scientific paper. The criminal is the ultimate pragmatist. When we arrived, back at 221B Baker Street, the familiar yellow light of our upstairs windows felt more welcoming than ever. Mrs. Hudson had, in our absence, placed a small, modest sprig of holly above the mantelpiece and prepared a tray of sandwiches and tea that made the frozen horrors of Oakhaven seem like a distant, unpleasant dream. Holmes immediately crossed to his chemical table, but he did not reach for his test tubes. Instead, he picked up his violin and began to play a low, melancholic air that seemed to capture the very essence of the winter twilight. I sat in my armchair, watching the firelight dance across the spines of our library, feeling a profound sense of gratitude for the warmth and the safety of our shared quarters. After a time, Holmes set down the bow and turned to me, his expression uncharacteristically soft. "You know, Watson," he said, Man is a strange creature. He builds chapels to reach for the divine, yet he uses the very stones of those chapels to hide his most devilish acts. We chase the impossible and the supernatural because we are afraid to face the simple, brutal reality of our own nature. And what is that reality, Holmes? That we are all, to some degree, masters of our own illusions. Sir Julian lived in a world of ancient curses to avoid the reality of his own loneliness. Arthur Burnaby lived in a world of debt and dissipation to avoid the weight of his own name. And Vane lived in a world of cold mechanics to avoid the burden of a conscience. He stepped toward the window, looking down at the street where the lamplighter was making his rounds through the deepening fog. We have cleared the air in Surrey, Watson. The St. Nicholas shadow has been dispelled by the light of a few simple observations, but do not think for a moment that the darkness is gone. It has merely moved to another alleyway, another drawing room, another heart. Our work is never truly done. We only move from one puzzle to the next, hoping that each solution brings us a fraction closer to understanding the great, chaotic machinery of the human soul. A sobering thought for Christmas, I noted. Holmes turned back to the room, a sharp, familiar glint returning to his eyes. Perhaps. But there is a certain satisfaction in the clarity, is there not? The truth, however grim, is always preferable to the most beautiful lie. And now, Watson, if you would be so kind as to pass me that ledger from the top shelf, I believe there was a very curious advertisement in the Daily Telegraph regarding a missing blue carbuncle that deserves a moment of our attention. I smiled, reaching for the ledger. The case of the Christmas chapel was closed, its mechanical ghosts laid to rest. But as I looked at my friend, the man who saw through the fog of human deception with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, I knew that for Sherlock Holmes, the greatest mystery would always be the one that lay just around the corner. To the next case then, Holmes. To the next case, Watson. The game is always afoot, provided one has the eyes to see the tracks. The fire crackled in the hearth, and for a moment the world felt balanced, logical, and entirely right. The morning of Boxing Day found London emerging from its festive slumber, though the city remained draped in a persistent silver-grey rime. At 221B Baker Street, the breakfast table had been cleared of its festive remnants, replaced by the clutter of my medical journals and the sprawling, ink-stained maps Holmes used to track the shifting tides of the criminal underworld. A sharp rap at the door preceded the arrival of the morning post. Among the usual collection of bills and invitations was a heavy, cream-colored envelope bearing the Burnaby crest. Holmes, who had been lazily tuning his violin, set the instrument aside and watched with a glimmer of renewed interest as I slit the wax seal. "From Oakhaven, I presume?" Holmes asked, though it was hardly a question. "Indeed," I replied, scanning the elegant script. "It is from Miss Evelyn St. Clair. She writes to inform us that the legal proceedings against Silas Vane have been formalized. The local authorities discovered the remains of the pneumatic pump hidden within a false-bottomed trunk in the steward's quarters. But there is more, Holmes. A bit of tragic irony that Vane could never have anticipated." Holmes leaned forward, his long fingers interlaced. "Irony is the favorite tool of the universe, Watson. Pray, read on. She says that in the wake of Sir Julian's death, they opened his private safe. Among his papers was a codicil to his will, dated only a week before the tragedy. Sir Julian had intended to retire from the active management of the estate. He was planning to settle a vast sum of money upon Vane as a reward for 20 years of service, a sum that would have made Vane a wealthy man in his own right, free to pursue whatever mechanical interests he desired." Holmes let out a short, mirthless laugh. So the cog was not being discarded, it was being promoted. Vane murdered the only man who was preparing to grant him the very freedom he claimed to be killing for. It is the perfect illustration of my point, Watson. Crime is a product of a warped perspective. Had Vane possessed the patience to wait for the natural progression of events, he would have inherited his fortune, without the shadow of the gallows looming over him. "It makes the whole affair seem even more senseless," I remarked, folding the letter. "Most crimes are, when viewed through the lens of reason," Holmes said, rising and moving to the window. He stood there for a long time, watching the hansom cabs rattle through the slushy streets below. Vane believed he was a master of cause and effect, yet he ignored the most fundamental variable human character. He judged Sir Julian by his eccentricities rather than his intentions. Holmes turned back to the room, his gaze landing on the silver hilt of the Moroccan dagger, which Lestrade had permitted him to keep as a memento of the case. He picked it up, weighing it in his palm. The Christmas chapel mystery will be remembered in the Yard as a triumph of forensics, I suppose. They will talk of ice bolts and nitrobenzene and the impossible crime. But for us, Watson, it serves as a reminder that the most elaborate machinery is nothing compared to the complexities of the human heart. The secret clue was never the scent of almonds, it was the scent of distrust. He tossed the hilt onto the sideboard, where it landed with a dull clatter among his chemical retorts. The transition was instantaneous. The philosopher vanished, replaced by the restless seeker of problems. He checked his pocket watch with a sharp, decisive click. But enough of the past. The past is a closed ledger, and I find my accounts for the new year are already beginning to accumulate. Have you seen my blue magnifying glass, Watson? And I believe I asked you to retrieve the file on the Countess of Morcar's missing gem. If we are to catch the 11:40 from Paddington, we have no time to waste on ancestral ironies. I smiled, reaching for my hat and coat. The cold, mechanical horror of the St. Nicholas Chapel was already fading, replaced by the familiar, bracing excitement of a new trail. As we descended the stairs into the London fog, I looked at Holmes, his back straight, his step light, his mind already miles ahead in search of the next puzzle. The case of the Christmas chapel was indeed over. The ghosts had been exorcised by logic, and the snow had melted away, leaving only the cold, hard truth of the world behind. But as long as Sherlock Holmes walked the streets of London, I knew that the impossible would never stand unchallenged. "Coming, Watson?" he called out from the doorway, his silhouette lost in the yellow gloom. "Right behind you, Holmes," I replied, "right behind you." The winter of 1895 bled into a damp and dreary spring, the kind that turns the London pavement into a slick of charcoal-coloured mud and brings a persistent hacking cough to the denizens of the East End. The case of the Christmas chapel had long since been filed away in the dispatch box that lived under my bed, yet its echoes lingered in the quiet moments between our more active investigations. It was on a particularly stormy evening in late March that the final chapter of the Oakhaven tragedy arrived at our door. I was busy cataloguing a collection of tropical fevers I had encountered during my time in Afghanistan, while Holmes was engaged in a delicate experiment involving the crystallization of various alkaloids. The sound of a carriage stopping at 221B was almost entirely drowned out by a sudden peal of thunder. "A visitor, Watson," Holmes remarked, not looking up from his Bunsen burner. "And if I am not mistaken, a visitor who has recently undergone a profound change of character. Note the deliberateness of the step, no longer the frantic pacing of a man in debt, but the steady tread of a man with a purpose." The door opened to reveal Arthur Burnaby. The transformation was indeed startling. Gone was the dissipated, trembling youth we had encountered in the shadow of his uncle's death. In his place stood a man of sober bearing, dressed in a suit of modest charcoal wool, his eyes clear and his jaw set with a newfound firmness. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, bowing slightly. "I hope I do not intrude upon your labours. I have just come from the Old Bailey." "Ah, the sentencing of Silas Vane," Holmes said, finally extinguishing his flame and turning his chair. "I trust the scales of justice were balanced with their usual cold precision." Arthur sank into the chair I offered him. "Vane has been sentenced to life imprisonment. The defence attempted a plea of insanity, citing his mechanical obsessions, but the evidence of his pneumatic system, the sheer calculated genius of it, convinced the jury of his absolute lucidity. He is to spend his remaining years in Broadmoor. A fitting end for a man who preferred the company of gears to the company of men," Holmes mused. "And what of Oakhaven, Mr. Burnaby, and the ward, Miss St. Clair?" "I have sold the estate," Arthur replied, a hint of sadness touching his voice. "The memory of that chapel, it was too heavy a burden. I have used a portion of the proceeds to establish a scholarship for engineering students at the London Polytechnic. I thought it a fitting tribute, to turn a skill that was used for destruction into one used for progress. Miss St. Clair has moved to the continent. She is studying the classics in Rome, away from the curses of Surrey." He reached into his breast pocket and produced a small leather-bound box. "Before I depart for my own new beginning in the north, I wanted to bring you this. It was found among my uncle's most private effects. He had intended it as a gift for the man who could solve the impossible riddle of the family line. Holmes opened the box. Inside lay a magnificent pocket watch, its casing wrought from frosted silver and etched with the image of a lone sentinel standing before a chapel. A beautiful piece of horology, I remarked, leaning in. More than that, Watson, Holmes said, his eyes scanning the mechanism with a practiced eye. Look at the escapement. It is a constant force mechanism designed to maintain perfect time regardless of the tension in the mainspring. Sir Julian was truly a master of his craft. Holmes stood up and walked to the window, the silver watch glinting in the gaslight. You know, Mr. Burnaby, your uncle and Silas Vane were two sides of the same coin. Both sought to control time, one through the beauty of creation, the other through the finality of death. You have done a wise thing in breaking the cycle. Arthur Burnaby thanked us once more and departed into the rain. As the sound of his carriage faded, Holmes returned to his chair, turning the silver watch over and over in his hands. You are thinking? About the case, Holmes, I asked. I am thinking about the fragility of logic, Watson. We rely on the impossible to be impossible. We rely on the laws of nature to be consistent. But when a man like Varney finds a way to weaponize those very laws, to turn a frozen breath into a dagger, the world becomes a much more precarious place. He looked at me, a rare spark of genuine warmth in his eyes. We have seen the best and worst of the machine age in this case, my dear fellow. But in the end, it was not a machine that saved Arthur Burnaby. It was the human capacity for observation and empathy. A machine can detect a heartbeat, Watson, but it can never understand why that heart beats with fear or hope. He placed the watch on the mantelpiece, right next to the silver hilt of the Moroccan dagger. The two objects, one a symbol of life's rhythm, the other a symbol of its sudden end, sat side by side in the quiet of Baker Street. And now, Watson, Holmes said, his voice regaining its sharp, energetic edge. I believe the rain has dampened the spirits of the criminal classes just enough to make them careless. Let us see if the evening papers have anything to say about the peculiar disappearance of the British Museum's cuneiform tablets. I have a suspicion that we may soon be trading the snows of Surrey for the dust of antiquity. I picked up my pen, ready to record the next entry in my journal. The Christmas chapel was now a memory, but as I looked at Holmes, I knew that the impossible was merely waiting for us in another form, in another corner of the great teeming city. The silver watch sat upon the mantelpiece for several days, its steady, rhythmic ticking a new heartbeat for the room. Holmes often found himself drawn to it, turning it over in the light of the gas lamp, his magnifying glass never far from his hand. To the casual observer, it was merely a fine piece of craftsmanship, but I knew my friend well enough to recognize the look of a man who sensed one final, lingering thread. It was on a Tuesday evening, as the fog outside grew so thick that the street lamps were reduced to mere amber smudges, that Holmes finally made his move. He took a thin surgical needle from his kit and, with a delicacy that would have put a diamond cutter to shame, began to probe the intricate filigree of the sentinel's shield on the outer casing. You suspect there is more to it, Holmes? I asked, putting down my book. Sir Julian was a man who lived in a world of locked boxes, Watson. It would be entirely inconsistent for him to leave a gift that was merely what it appeared to be. A watch tells the time, but a masterpiece tells a story. With a soft metallic click, the back of the watch didn't just open, it slid aside on a hidden track. A second, inner lid was revealed, crafted from a gold so thin it was almost translucent. On it, in an inscription so small it required the highest power of Holmes's lens to read, was a final testament. Look here, Watson, Holmes whispered. I leaned in. The inscription read, To the one who sees the gears behind the ghost, the shadow on the wall is but the projection of a hidden hand. If you read this, you have proved that reason is the only true sentinel. Beneath the words was a tiny, precisely etched diagram, a schematic of the very pneumatic system Vane had used for the murder. Great heavens, I cried. He knew? Sir Julian knew what Vane was doing? Not exactly, Holmes replied, his eyes shining with a dark brilliance. He knew that someone was tampering with his designs. He was a master horologist. He would have noticed the slight drop in air pressure, the subtle misalignment of his tubes. He suspected a betrayal, but his paranoia, that curse he so often spoke of, prevented him from seeing that the demon was his own steward. He created this watch as a final trap, a way to speak from beyond the grave to whoever possessed the wit to listen. Holmes snapped the watch shut and returned it to the... He looked at the silver hilt and the watch sitting side by side, the instrument of death and the instrument of truth. Element, the illusion, the impossible. The reality, the logical, the locked room. Sir Julian was alone in a chapel bolted from the inside. The murder was committed from a distance using a pneumatic delivery system. The pristine snow, no footprints led to or from the chapel during the blizzard. The killer never left the manor. Copper tubing was hidden beneath the floorboards. The weapon, a silver-handled dagger, was found in the victim's heart. An ice bolt made of frozen nitrobenzene, it melted and vanished into the bloodstream. The scent, a smell of bitter almonds, suggested a supernatural or gas-based curse. Nitrobenzene, a chemical used as a solvent and projectile, which carries that specific odor. The culprit's suspicion fell on the indebted heir, Arthur Burnaby. Silas Vane, the steward, who used his mechanical skill to secure his future. A remarkable case, Holmes, I said, leaning back in my chair. One that I shall title The Case of the Christmas Chapel. It has all the elements, the locked room, the invisible weapon, and the final irony of the victim's own brilliance providing the solution. It has one more thing, Watson, Holmes remarked, reaching for his tobacco pouch. It has the reminder that the most dangerous machines are not made of brass and steel, but of envy and silence. Vane thought he was an engineer of fate, but he was merely a man who forgot that even the most perfect mechanism leaves a trace. He struck a match, the flare illuminating his sharp, hawk-like features. The case was truly closed. The shadow had been dispelled. The heir had been redeemed. And the master of 221B had once again proven that there is no mystery so deep that a focused mind cannot plumb its depths. And now, Watson, Holmes said, the smoke curling around his head like a grey shroud. The 11:40 to Paddington awaits us in the morning. I suggest you pack your heavy ulster. The British Museum's missing tablets are calling, and I've a feeling the sands of the East will be quite a change from the snows of Surrey. I am ready, Holmes, I replied. Then let us sleep, my dear fellow, for the game, as always, is never truly finished, it merely changes its skin. The fire in the hearth settled into a deep, glowing red, casting long shadows across the room, shadows that for once held no secrets that Sherlock Holmes had not already mastered.